Okay, so the Pharisees are this holiness movement, this purity movement. They have this sense of holiness is essential. And there's a debate among the Pharisees between a rigorist school and what you could call a pastoral school. So how do you understand the law? Do you apply it rigorously? Or do you have a sense that this is a law for people and that the most important part is the people to have a life of holiness? And sometimes it's not something that happens overnight. It's not an instant thing. It's not just because you tell them to do the right thing that they do the right thing. And so there's this debate. In Judaism, it's called the debate between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Shammai is the rigorist, and Hillel is the more pastoral one. Paul himself is probably in the school of Shammai. I don't know. I would have to look up better, but he would follow rabbis that are more in line with the rigorist position, which this same debate actually happens in Christianity. It happens especially after some of the Roman persecutions start and a debate between what are called the Donatists and the Catholics. Like when if you are a Christian and the Romans force you offer sacrifices to the gods or whatever because you want to spare the life of your family or something, so you publicly rejected the way of Christianity. What happens when you repent? What needs to happen when you repent? Do you need to be rebaptized? Do you need to be confirmed again? What is the process for restoration? And that takes a long time to hammer out. The church ultimately decides something that you're probably familiar with, that baptism is a sacrament that you receive once, and so you don't need to be rebaptized. But we would talk now about renewing your baptism, that you would have to renew that. The early church had a lot stronger rigorous standards. And one of the problems that we live in today is that our world has sort of decided, and this happens to us too, that these distinctions aren't all that important anyway, and so, well, as long as they're worshiping God, it doesn't matter. We live very much in an age that does not like rigorism. And that's not to say that it's bad or that it's good, but just that this is the age that we live in. And if you were talking about the middle road, if you were talking about where grace really is, where the Lord really is, I think we would have to admit that we probably need a bit more rigorism in our lives today. That breaking commandments shouldn't just be routine and, oh, I can go to confession later, but this is something serious. This is something that is about heaven and hell. It's about judgment. It's about, it's not just fluffiness. It's not just passing clouds. And this is one of the struggles that we live in. That same debate was playing out at the time of Paul. So there's the rigorous Pharisees, there's the more pastoral Pharisees. Chances are we don't see a lot of the pastoral Pharisees around because many of them are likely the ones that became Christians and because they tend not to get into as many fights with people. The Sadducees control the temple priesthood. The Sadducees sound like a religious party, but I would argue that they're actually probably political first and political foremost. It's a compromise party. So the Pharisees are like, you can't even go in a Roman house, you can't walk by them in the marketplace, or you have to go bathe and be cleansed, and Gentile dust is contaminating. The Sadducees are like, well, the Gentiles are in charge, so we should go to their parties and kind of still be Jewish, but, we can sort of bend the rules a little bit because it's about the survival of the nation. Now again, it's easy to critique this kind of position as being completely wrong, but it happens all the time. this kind of thing, the compromises that you make in order to keep the peace. Lots of us, we live in an age, especially in North Dakota, that is very non-confrontational. Rather than confront problems and actually talk about them and where they are, we do things to keep the peace. And so if keeping the peace means that something is off limits and never talked about, it usually becomes off limits and never talked about. This is the same kind of thing with the Sadducees. They have made some compromises with the Romans. They probably still, some of them, the better elements of the Sadducees, probably still want to cling to Jewish identity. And they're a little bit like, making the Romans mad all the time isn't going to help. Which is probably true. The people with sharp sticks and pointy hats can put you at the end of the sharp stick. And making them mad all the time isn't good. Sometimes the best answer to trouble is to run away from it. But it is a very much a compromise party. And this is part of the reason why the Essenes have talked about rejecting the temple and rejecting the sacrifices, is the temple priests that are in charge of the sacrifices have compromised with the Romans. They're compromising theologically, they're sort of in bed with the Romans. They probably pay them off like, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, you do your thing, we do our thing. The Zealots are firecrackers. You have this nice, uneasy mix. All of the ingredients are there. You have some hot peppers in the Pharisees and some, milder ingredients in the Sadducees. And then along come the Zealots, and it's like dumping a bottle of hot sauce into it. Because the Zealots are the people that have said that corruption runs so deep, this is such a problem that the answer to preserve the nation is violence. So not just that the Romans are wrong, but we should kill them. And so at festivals in Jerusalem, they would routinely sneak up and attack Roman soldiers. They would ambush their caravans through the countryside. They made life as difficult as possible for the Romans in the hopes that they would leave. This, on the other hand, is likely the cause of a lot of the tension. Because if you're the Romans, well, it's sort of like police officers in places that are facing struggles in our own country today. Right? Like all of this stuff eventually pushes you toward a position that's shoot on sight, ask questions later. You're pushed into a more extreme position because to try and get a handle on the violence, to try and tamp things down, you have to swing hard and swing fast. There's a country in Central America that built a prison, and they decided, like in the drug wars, that the best solution to it is just to arrest everyone in all the drug gangs. So they've arrested like 60,000 people or something and put them all in a prison together. And it's not a comfortable prison. No, it's not necessarily the right answer or the wrong answer to the problem. There's still issues going on. But it's again one of these positions. So the Zealots are attacking and killing Romans constantly. The Romans usually respond by killing people or imposing taxes or crucifying people on the way to Jerusalem and all kinds of things. So there's this sort of hot mess of a stew happening in the background. The Romans also, to their great and everlasting credit, or not, decide not to send their brightest bulbs in the basket to Palestine. If you wanted to be a Roman governor and you wanted to be in charge of some good things, you wanted to stay like in Italy or in Athens. Athens is nice. Or in France. France was a nice Roman province. Germany, not so much. The Germans were problematic and caused issues, and they had lots of fights. But the Romans rarely send the good ones to Palestine. That means, like you take this tinderbox and now you throw kind of corrupt and meddling administration on top of it, and you kind of have a recipe for some explosiveness, right? Sending the 2-year-old to the kitchen where they can get into the flower basket. If you do that, should you be surprised when the flour ends up all over the floor? No. Or all over the ceiling. Sometimes you do end up getting surprised, like, how did you get it in there? So, this history is happening. If you remember, there's this guy named Quirinius, who is the one that shows up in the Gospel of Luke near the birth of Jesus. It talks about in the time of Caesar Augustus, yada yada yada, the census of Quirinius, when Quirinius was governor of Judea, or whatever it says. His census is why Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem. That census caused problems, because usually they have a census so that they know who you are and where you live, so that you have to pay taxes or have to serve in the Roman army. Like, censuses were not just counting people for innocent things. You were doing something with the census numbers. So there's a response to the census of Quirinius. There's some fights in various places. The tensions are also cultural. That Greek culture was very antithetical to Jewish culture. Greek culture was, one of the famous Greek gods is Bacchus, and a bacchanalia was sort of think of a modern day frat party, and you're in the right direction. Greek culture was very loose and free-flowing. You can do what you want. None of it really matters anyway. Fate is in charge of everything. The Greeks were fond of sports, so they would build gymnasiums. That's actually a Greek word. But it also meant that they exercised naked, and you could tell the difference between Greeks and Jews rather readily. There's Roman law and Roman customs. There is the religious fight that Rome and Greece basically adopt each other's gods, and they just rename things. So Zeus becomes Jupiter and Mars, and lots of the names of planets turn out to be Roman names of Greek gods. They were it's called syncretism, like they just take the parts of it, and like, well, to make everyone happy, we'll just smash it all together. You have your gods, you have your gods, we all get along, yay, we're a happy family. The Romans were also fond of taxing people, although, it's hard to say, like, how burdensome it was. Many people at this time were subsistence farmers, or subsistence living. It meant that they didn't have a lot of surplus in the system. They didn't have savings if something went wrong. If it went wrong, it all went south at the same time. So the Romans like to erect statues of Roman emperors. And they like to put them in places like synagogues and temples. If you were a Jewish person, would you want a statue of the Roman emperor in the temple? Probably not, especially when the Roman emperors demand to be worshipped as gods. Today, we might put a picture of the president somewhere so you remember to pay for him, but we have a very different sense that we don't worship presidents, no matter who they are or what direction they are. But the Romans do this. They put up statues. The Jews don't like it. They tear them down. The Romans get angry. They put up more statues and put fences around them. And the Jews tear those down. Tinderbox. Can't you just feel how this is going to go? How many things can go wrong at the same time before it finally explodes? The Zealots begin their armed rebellion and attacking Roman soldiers directly in the year 6, most likely. So this is 50 years ago, 50 years in hindsight at the time that we're looking at with Paul. They had a sort of fanatical opposition to Roman rule. Compromise is impossible. The only answer is to kill all the Romans. And that's going to be problematic. The Romans sometimes realized that antagonizing the Jewish people wasn't going well, and so maybe we shouldn't try and make them angry. And on the other hand, sometimes they got angry enough to do a bunch of crazy things, so they'd crucify hundreds of people. Which, of course, is going to make things better. There's also this mess of a political situation because there's sort of Jewish kings and Roman governors. There's this really weird thing that you probably haven't thought about so much. Because Pontius Pilate was a Roman, I think he's called a Roman governor of Judea, but he was probably a procurator. And then there's a Herodian king. Well, who is he? If Rome's in charge, why is there a king? And why isn't the king Roman? Hence the mess. So this is a region where there's a lot of dual loyalties. Herod, I think Herod the First, or Herod the Great as he's called, maybe we should call him Herod the Lousy. Herod the Lousy went to Rome eventually and managed to either bribe or impress or somehow got his way into the good graces of the Romans. So the Romans said, oh, you can be king. You can be a king and kind of be a bridge between these stupid Jews and us nice Romans. So you go be in charge and you support us and we'll support you and everything will be peachy. But Herod was an Edomite. He's from the east side of the Jordan River. That would be very much a compromised position. The Pharisees would say, you're not Jewish. The Zealots would say, you have to die. And the Sadducees would say, everything's fine. Look, we have a Jewish king. So there's Jewish kings and they rule some things, but they don't have a lot of authority when it comes to taxation and military stuff. They can govern the day-to-day things, they can administer stuff, but they don't have a sort of ultimate authority that's reserved to the Romans. And at first, it's called a Roman procurator. This is a financial position, sort of like a tax authority. The one that everyone likes, the ancient version of the IRS. Except he does it with swords instead of letters. And then eventually there's Roman governors. In Rome, a governor is a fairly high-ranking person. They're appointed in some provinces directly by the Senate. It was one of the places where the Senate had some authority. And other ones are appointed by the emperor himself. The emperor reserves the right to appoint governors in places where there's military battles. So the frontiers of the empire, Germania, the northern part of France, north in England, north of Hadrian's Wall, the Scots and the Picts. So England was a province where the governor was appointed by the emperor himself, and it was usually a military general whose goal was to be in charge, and they ran it like the military to tamp down rebellion against Rome. So eventually Palestine, for much of its history, has a procurator, which means it's not as established as a Roman place, it's not as integrated into the Roman system, and it means that there's a lot of military conflict. Eventually, the military kind of takes over and then kills lots of people, and then a governor is appointed, and this is sort of how they solve it. In addition, there's more messes. I mean, it's like once you start down this path, how much better can it get? This is also something that would be very scary in the modern world because we've never experienced one. And that is, there was a famine from 44 to 48, so about 10 years in the rearview mirror at the time that we're looking at. In Judea mostly, starvation was widespread. People were dying from a lack of nutrition, probably because there wasn't enough rain. That they had a climate blip, they had something. Israel isn't the best place for growing things anyway, and they fight over it a lot, and it's hard to grow things when they fight over it a lot. It's one of the things also that I would say in the United States we're not very used to, because we have the percentage of arable land or arable land in the States is extremely high compared to our land mass. So you can actually grow large amounts of food on land in much of our country. Places where you can't tend to be very mountainous or hilly. But we have these broad, flat plains that basically go from the Rocky Mountain foothills to the Appalachians. It's like 1,500 miles of flat land that happens to be good for farming. That's relatively rare. In some countries, arable land is like 5% of the total land mass. It doesn't mean you can't have a garden. Like, you can grow a garden just about anywhere. But there's too much rocks, there isn't enough topsoil close to the surface, you have to fight with it a lot. So there's this famine that happens, and it's the worst spot in the world at the time is in ancient Judea. At least the world as in the Mediterranean world, the Roman world that we're talking about. So when there's a famine and there's tension and there's people dying, it creates even more pressure against the Romans. You shouldn't tax us so much because we don't have enough money for food. The Romans are like, yeah, but we still have to pay our soldiers and you keep killing people. And if you're Romans, it probably also means that what food there is, you steal. Because you have swords and they don't. Survival of the fittest is not very nice, and it's not very pleasant. So, by the time of 65 or 66, the flames erupt into open armed rebellion. This is civil war. So this is about 5 or 6 years after, maybe 7 years after this time of Paul. So it's this increasing tension, sort of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's at the Cuban Missile Crisis for a while, and then it explodes. The Romans put a golden eagle in the courtyard of the temple. The Jews freak out. They start murdering people left and right. The Romans actually retreat from the land for a while. They move out. But it's sort of the calm before the storm. And when the storm hits, it's going to change life in the Middle East forever. So the Romans pull out for a while, they reorganize, they bring in some extra legions, and then with something like 50 or 60,000 trained soldiers, they march back into the country. And now there's no more compromise, now there's no more negotiation. It's we're burning it to the ground. You will die. Unless there's a few places, so it's not as bad in Galilee, because the Galileans were used to living with the Romans for a longer time, and they sort of had it figured out. You know, you do your thing, we do our thing. But the Zealots and the Pharisees basically go ballistic. The Romans are marching in, they want God to come and save them from the evil Romans who are trying to destroy their nation. The result is that he doesn't. The temple is destroyed in something like 67 or 70 AD, 67 to 70. And later, the last Jewish outpost in the Holy Land is at Masada. If you've been to Israel, some of you have probably gone there. It's this mountaintop fortress out by the Dead Sea. That was the last place. And part of the ramp that the Romans built up to the fortress is still there. When the Romans surround Jerusalem and make a siege of it, it gets so bad that the people resort to cannibalism. They start eating each other. Some of the stories indicate that they kill between 1 million and 1.5 million people when they break down the walls of the city. Enough that the ground turns red. And they basically, by that time, are willing to commit genocide, which doesn't help tensions. In fact, about 70 years after this, 60 or 70 years after that, is called the Bar Kokhba revolt, and another Jewish guy got in charge. Lots of people considered him to be the Messiah. He decided to oppose the Romans and tried, some early successes again, but when the professionals of the Roman army move in, they really move in. And that's when they basically wipe Israel off the map. They make it illegal to refer to it in history books. They write it out of everything. They knock down the temple. They build the temple to Jupiter on the same spot. They destroy every institution of Jewish life they can get their hands on. This is also why the Jewish exodus sort of happens again, and they leave the Holy Land. And the strongholds of Judaism become the synagogues in places like Alexandria, and in a town called Jamnia or Yavnia on the coast, modern-day Yafo near Tel Aviv. One of the challenges is that in this time of tension, there's disagreements even among the Jewish people what to do about the Roman problem. And it's not clear what the best answer is. Do you compromise? Do you not compromise? What are the consequences of doing that? It happens a lot. It happens to Christianity. We've seen and lived in a place and an age, many of you, where there was a lot of inter-Christian tensions. So realistically, while the world is falling apart and tearing apart Christianity at the seams and the family's disintegrating, lots of you grew up in a world where the major concern of the Baptists was that you never went to the Catholic Church. And the major concern of the Catholics was that you did not even think about setting foot in the Baptist Church. And meanwhile, civilization around you burned to the ground. So it takes a lot of energy when you're spending it on internal struggles and civil wars. And it's not to say that the positions aren't important or there aren't reasons why those debates happened, but it's odd that so much energy is spent internally when the external enemies are actually far more dangerous. We see a lot of this same division, the conservatives versus the liberals in Catholicism and Protestantism in our nation, and you see easily how it gets mixed up between religion and politics and what religion requires and what politics requires, and it's this giant mess of things. If you don't see it, put on your hard hat and welcome to the next election. Because I was thinking one day, I was like, it'd be nice when this is over in November. And then I thought, but it's not. It's over next November. It's not a presidential election year. Lovely, you were just waiting for a bit of good news. I know it. And realistically, it's rather odd. Like, we had some debates on the college campus where I was a focus missionary, and some people decided, this minister came in and he decided that he wanted to convert all of the Christians who were believing unbiblical things. And so he spent a lot of time basically yelling at us, fellow missionaries, and trying to storm into other places like a Lutheran Student Center and the Newman Center and telling everyone they were wrong and shouting at people. He didn't last very long. And realistically, on a college campus, there's far more atheists or agnostics or people that don't think about it. You really don't need to fight each other, because at the end of the day, it's not, Catholics versus Protestants. It's Christians versus the world. And one would suggest to him now that it would be far more intelligent to work on the people that weren't coming than to make everyone mad who's sort of on your side. But nonetheless. So this is the background of Paul and why things are so odd. There was this tension. Paul gets arrested by the Sanhedrin. They're trying to kill him. They're shouting. They're rioting. The Romans can't figure out what's going on, so they charge into it with a group of soldiers. They lift up Paul. They carry him out. They bring him back to the barracks. This is why. This is a situation that's happening in the background. It's present in the life of Jesus, but to a lesser degree. The tensions weren't as high at that point, but they were still there. So Paul engages in this defense before the Jews. He tells his conversion story again. And it says he addresses them brothers and fathers in their ancestral language. Now this is a little bit complicated, because if you read this, you would think that that means Hebrew, right? It would mean Hebrew to a modern. If you talked about the ancestral language of the Jews, you'd probably say Hebrew. But in the biblical world, they don't really distinguish between Hebrew and Aramaic. We do now, but they're very, very close. Hebrew uses an Aramaic alphabet, for instance, to write its script. There's an old Hebrew, and it's really strange and hard to write, that was more like pictographs. they eventually adopt this Aramaic script. Aramaic was the lingua franca, the spoken language of the Middle East at this time. Aramaic, the name comes from Aram, which is the ancient word for Syria. So you could call it ancient Syrian. And the Bible doesn't distinguish between them. So Abba is, I think, an Aramaic word. There's a bunch of them that Jesus uses that are Aramaic instead of Hebrew. And so it's really not clear. It means that it could be Hebrew. He could have addressed them in Hebrew, but Hebrew was likely a language of prayer that was different than the language that was spoken every day. So if you wanted to be understood, you'd probably speak in Aramaic. The disciples of Jesus probably used Aramaic most of the time. Paul also knows Greek because he speaks to several people in Greek. He speaks with the Romans. They would have used Greek in this part of the ancient world. That was another one of the tensions. The Romans of the West speak Latin, write in Latin. The Romans of the eastern part of the empire speak Greek and write in Greek. That tension plays into Christianity as well, between the Catholics and the Orthodox eventually. So Paul focuses on his Jewishness. He talks about being a Jew. He was a Jew born of Jewish people. He's educated in Jerusalem by Gamaliel, one of the revered members of the Sanhedrin. He was a Pharisee. He earned his stripes by beating the snot out of Christians and arresting them and dragging them out of synagogues, and actually admits to having many of them killed. Paul, it turns out, is a converted murderer. Oh, Gamaliel, I was wrong. Gamaliel was part of the rabbinic school of Hillel, not Shammai. So Paul isn't actually most in line with the rigorous version of the Pharisees. He would be in Hillel. He doesn't sound very compromising, but you can kind of get a flavor for the position. He is a Pharisee. He's zealous for God. This is a good thing to ponder as well. I think one of the questions that I wrote was about this. What does being zealous for God mean? He was willing to put great effort into this. It was like the consuming passion of his life. This isn't just a passing fancy, it's not the latest fad, this is something that he's committed to. Dragging people out of synagogues, kicking and screaming, is not light-hearted devotion. This is not just, are you going to paint your room red or blue? I might say, neither, I'm going to paint it cream. Whatever. Paul is zealous for God. And I think it's a good thing to ask, like, what are you zealous for? What is a consuming thing in your life? What has this kind of energy and this kind of devotion, this kind of passion? Eventually, I think in Christianity, the hope is that it becomes loving Jesus. It becomes